Time now for the clash. And hours before the PM announced that the self-isolation law would be scrapped this month, the health minister apologised for continuing a meeting despite shock horror having COVID. Gillian Keegan found out she had tested positive during a meeting yesterday but pressed ahead anyway before isolating afterwards. Keegan announced late last night, "When I was told my test was positive, I was listening to 3 fathers who had tragically lost their daughters to suicide. I told them the result and took further precautions, but with their consent, I stayed for a short period to hear their stories. I should have immediately ended the meeting, and on reflection, this was an error of judgment on my part. I fully recognise the importance of following the letter and spirit of the policy, so I want to be upfront about what happened and apologise for the mistake I made." Now, Keegan isn't going to lose her job, but it got us asking the question whether infected people should be able to make their own choice about mixing in public as we enter the potential bliss of a post-pandemic world. So, what do you think? Are you happy to let the positive mix freely in society? Dan at GBNews.uk or tweet me at GBNews. We've got our poll running there too. But first, let me bring in the rapper and star podcaster Zuby, the broadcaster Bev Turner, and the University of Exeter Medical School lecturer Dr. David Strain to debate this. So, Zuby, let me kick off with you. I think this is about respect. And of course, if you are particularly sick and with any type of illness and you're symptomatic, the sensible thing is to stay home for a couple of days. But should there be a legal requirement for you to do that? I say absolutely not. Where do you stand?
Dan, you've taken the words completely out of my mouth. I agree with you 100% when it comes to what happened here with Gillian Keegan. I don't think she did anything wrong at all. I think it's very telling that she informed the people immediately who she was meeting with that she was COVID positive, and they themselves were happy to continue with the meeting with some additional distancing and precautions. So that's fine. I'm sure if they'd said, "Oh, we're worried, we're not comfortable," she would have been happy to end it immediately. But given the circumstances, I don't think she did anything wrong. And I agree with you, just like with a cold, a flu, anything else, if you are sick, the sensible and correct and respectful thing to do is to avoid meeting with other people. If they're comfortable with it and they're friends, family, etc., then that's a different story. But I don't think that we need the hard arm of the law and the state involvement in this.
Because, Bev Turner, that's been one of the really difficult things for me across the course of this pandemic. We're saying we don't trust folk to make sensible decisions. And the only way society works is if we do trust folk to make sensible decisions.
We have to kind of think what life used to be like before the last 2 years. And what I've noticed recently, which I find really odd, is that people are going about with coughs and colds and things and going, well, it's okay, I can come to your event because it isn't COVID. Previously, we would have all been quite courteous and go, do you know what, I've got a cough, I'm not going to come to your event, I don't want to infect anybody. And yet now it's like, because nothing but COVID matters, we are actually behaving in a way that's so different to how we were behaving 2 years ago. And I think we do have to be understanding, we do have to be sympathetic to people who will be terrified by the idea of the infected walking amongst us, because they have been so dehumanized, they've been demonized as though we have some sort of monster in our midst. So it's going to take a huge amount of de-radicalization for some people to be happy with this notion. But it's what we need to do, Dan. We need to do this to get back to some sort of semblance of real life. We can't be locking teenagers away. We can't be keeping teenagers off school, teachers off school. We can't be keeping doctors off work because they've got the Omni cold. It's crazy, and it is time to move on.
Dr. Strain, you disagree with Bev strongly, don't you?
Well, we're in a position that we actually don't know what the real figures are. The government's reported 68,000 on the same day that the Zoe app has recorded 203,000 cases yesterday. And we are in a position that, since we are dependent on the population to report COVID, which still is the mandate, that the discrepancy between the independents and the official government figures have turned into this threefold discrepancy. Until we get to the bottom of what this discrepancy is and where it is, then we are in a position that if we get rid of the need for people to be testing and then isolating, we are effectively sending our elderly, our vulnerable, those who are being treated for conditions like cancer, like bloodborne diseases, and therefore the vaccine's not as potent for them, we are putting them back into isolation. And until we get to the bottom of this, then we are actually condemning a group, a significant population, to this risk.
Dr. Strain,
that
can I
they
just pick you
are
up on
going to
that?
be put into.
Can I just pick you up on that, Dr. Strain? Because the infection fatality rate, now that Omicron has become the main variant in this country, is comparable to flu, the latest statistics show. We never used to have these same considerations during a winter flu season, where we would seriously talk about restricting the rest of the population because of a small group of poor folk who are extremely ill. So what's different now?
So we are talking very much about the BA1 Omicron variant. We're now on to 4 different variations of Omicron. And although the trajectory from Delta to Omicron has been very much that the disease is appearing to be less severe, we have absolutely no idea what the next variant will hold. Remember that when we went from the wild type to the Alpha variant, and then from the Alpha to Delta variant, there was a step increase in mortality with each of those. We now have the first variant that shows a drop down, and I am all in favor of getting this. We all want to get back to normal. I don't want to be opening more COVID wards like I've been doing today. I don't want to be in a position where I'm cancelling operations for these people to be cared for in hospital, where we're cancelling vital procedures that will improve other people's quality of life, because the wards are being overwhelmed with COVID. And whatever the national figures show, I can absolutely guarantee you that I've been coming out of meetings today trying to figure out how we are going to try and keep some general semblance of normal activity in the hospital going, whilst at the same time caring for this huge number of patients that have started coming in since the lifting of the Plan B restrictions. Now, don't get me wrong, I do want to get rid of this. I do want to get rid of these different elements. But until we have clarities of which is the right figure, is it the Zoe figure or the ONS figure, which says 1 in 20 people have got COVID in the last week, or is it the government figures, which would actually have the estimate of about 1 in 120 having COVID? Which of these organizations have got it right? And once we figure out which one is right, then make the appropriate decision. If it's the 1 in 120 that the government dashboard would be showing, then actually, yeah, it probably is the right time. But if it's the 1 in 20,
case numbers irrelevant now. What matters is the death rate, and we know that that has plummeted. And I actually view high case numbers, Zubi, as a pretty positive thing, because it's this great natural immunity, and the more folk that get Omicron, I mean, I've had it, complete pussycat.
Yeah, I mean, I think Omicron. So in terms of the details of the virus and its evolution, it seems clear to me, just as we know with the flu, for example, that this is going to continue to mutate and change, and that's going to go forever. So by the logic that I'm hearing, this could just go on forever. I mean, there's always going to be some type of justification. There's always going to be unknowns and discrepancies. And if people are not dying at extraordinary rates or being hospitalized at extraordinary rates, then I'll be honest, none of these restrictions made sense to me to begin with. And I think it comes back up a level to a more philosophical question, which is, do we trust members of our society to generally behave in a correct and respectful way, or do we not? Do we think that we need to use the force of the state to enforce this? Because every time you're advocating a policy, and people always forget this, you are advocating for the usage of agents of the state. You're advocating for the use of police to potentially come and apprehend people and fine them or imprison them if they are breaking any of these laws. And I don't think that is necessary. It's never been necessary during the cold and the flu season, despite the fact that the flu kills a lot of people. I think people have forgotten this. People think that the flu is a very mild virus that doesn't cause any damage. That's never been the case. It's just that we're used to it. Right? We are used to it. So when you hear the term flu, it sounds very familiar. Whereas with COVID and Delta and Omicron, all of this, it sounds very new and novel. And I think that scares people more. So I'm very much in the position that we need to be able to trust the British people. We need to be able to trust our friends, neighbors, relatives. And people need to just have common sense and say, look, if I'm sick, I'm not feeling good, I know that when I had COVID myself, I wouldn't even have been able to go out and socialize if I'd wanted to. And also, I have common sense. I don't want to go out there and infect anybody else, and I don't need the government to try to force me to do that.
No, indeed. And Bev, look, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Strain as a medic, but isn't one of the issues that the medical profession now think it's almost normal for the mechanisms of state to be used to protect public health? And that isn't normal. It shouldn't be normal in a free society, and we have to be very clear about that.
Absolutely. One of the big issues we've had from day one, Dan, and you and I have both been asked, calling for this publicly whenever we could, what is the metric which indicates we are out of this? And we have never had that from the government. And
Never.
even when
No.
we have...
Even now?
Never. We never have. And so when like you, when I hear Dr. Strain talk about these case numbers, it's just kind of, it's white noise, because what does that mean? These numbers in themselves in a vacuum are utterly meaningless, and they are hopefully giving great immunity, great natural immunity around the country. If Boris Johnson had said, when we have X number of deaths per day, you're all free, or even when we have X number of cases per day, you're all free, they wouldn't even ballpark it. They haven't ballparked it from day one, which is why we're having this conversation now, because there was never a finish line. They kept moving the goalposts. If you remember, they moved the goalposts on an almost monthly basis. It was a type of psychological torture for most of us. And we're still there now. And so, and so we've got this line now in a couple of weeks' time. Great. But he's still leaving us hanging, saying if the data continues in the way that it appears to, then we will be free of domestic restrictions. Well, I still think there's a chink in his armor. Like, there is a lift, the door is ajar. He doesn't necessarily have to free us in a week. I think that will be 2 weeks. That will be a political decision. I think this is largely a political decision, because it isn't based on numbers. We still haven't been given it. It isn't based necessarily on the science. And Dr. Strain and the three of us would probably agree on that in principle, that it would have been nice to have a clear metric. We may not agree on what the outcome should be now.
Well, indeed.
But I think we'd all like to know what looks like the finish.
And David Strain, just finally to you, I would argue, now that you have 98% of English adults with COVID antibodies, whether that's via natural infection, whether it's by vaccination, if that's not the finish line, if we're not at the finish line now, this thing never ends.
I would absolutely agree with what's just been said. We've all been calling for that finish line all the way through. Personally, I'd say it is the point where waiting lists are coming down rather than going up, because that's the metric we're judging it by. People are not getting their operations at the moment that will be improving their quality of life and their longevity within the UK, because their beds are being filled with people with COVID. My metric would be, as soon as those waiting lists are coming down, as soon as it's back to expecting a 3 months to get...
So it's the waiting lists now. Bev, that's a new one, Bev. It's the waiting lists now. It's the waiting lists. Okay.
I just don't buy it. There's a tiny percentage of beds which are being taken up by people who are there purely because of COVID.
And the hospitalisations are coming way down. But look, what a respectful discussion. Thank you so much to all three of you. That was the rapper and podcaster Zuby, the broadcaster Bev Turner, and the University of Exeter Medical School lecturer Dr. David Strain. Thank you to you all. So who did you agree with? Ben on Twitter says, if you're coughing, spluttering and actually ill, then for your sake and everyone else's, stay at home. But we need to stop testing healthy people, or else this is never going to stop. Completely agree, by the way. Stop testing the healthy. I've always said that. Penelope on Twitter says, although I agree with lifting restrictions, I think anyone with COVID should avoid others for 5 days. There are many vulnerable people out there who cannot have the vaccine. And Martin on email says, we mix with people who may have the flu, and this is no worse. We must live with this virus and with other illnesses, absolutely. And I think the really great thing, by the way, about those lateral flow tests is that it actually tells you when you are infectious. So let's drop this arbitrary 5-day thing. When I had Omicron, I was literally infectious, according to the lateral flow tests, for 2 days. You know that little line? Only 2 days. For other people, it's 10 or 11 days. So again, that's why we shouldn't have these rules. We should be able to make sensible decisions for ourselves. And your verdict's now in. You're a very sensible bunch. 81% of you are happy to let COVID-positive people mix freely in society, while 19% of you say COVID should not be able to roam free.